Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were doing something obscene to a particularly hideous Cattleya hybrid when the doorbell rang at 11 minutes past 11, which is to say, right in the middle of Wolfe's morning ritual upstairs, leaving me alone in the office with nothing but the Times crossword and a craving for an early lunch. I went to the door, because that's my job, among the 40 or so other jobs I hold down in that brownstone on West 35th Street, and found a woman on the stoop who looked like she'd dressed for a funeral she wasn't sure she'd been invited to. Black suit, good cut, a little too good for someone who'd walked instead of taken a cab. I could tell from the set of her shoulders, the way people brace themselves against wind they've been fighting for 6 blocks. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said, which is what they all say, as if the name alone might part doors the way Moses parted water. "He's not available until 11, I said. "Orchids, sacred hour. But I can take your name and your trouble, and decide for myself whether it's worth interrupting him." That got a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe respect, across her face. "Eleanor Crane," she said, "and it's about my husband, Garrett Crane. He's dead, and the police think it was an accident, and I know it wasn't." I let her in. You don't leave a woman with a dead husband and a grievance against the NYPD standing on a stoop in March, not if you've got any manners at all. And despite what people say about me, I've got manners when manners are useful. I parked her in the front room and made the kind of small talk that tells you more than direct questions do, about the walkover, about the weather, about whether she wanted coffee, and learned that Garrett Crane had been found at the bottom of the stairs in his own brownstone 4 days prior, neck broken, and that the medical examiner had called it consistent with a fall. I also learned that Eleanor Crane did not believe in convenient falls, not for a man who'd walked those same stairs twice a day for 9 years without incident, and certainly not for a man who'd told her 8 days before he died that he was being blackmailed. By 11:30, Wolfe had descended via the elevator, having traded the orchids for his desk, and I brought Mrs. Crane in. Wolfe does not stand for women, or for anyone as a rule, on the theory that gravity has already done him the favor of getting him into the chair, and he sees no reason to undo its work twice in a morning. He inclined his head about an inch, which from him is practically a bow, and gestured at the red leather chair. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "Archie tells me your husband died. He was murdered. The police believe otherwise." "The police," she said, with the particular contempt reserved by the recently bereaved for institutions that have failed them, "believe whatever lets them close a file by Friday." Wolfe's eyes, which I've described elsewhere as resembling nothing so much as 2 dark pools that have given up reflecting anything back, settled on her with the faint interest he reserves for people who might turn out to be interesting rather than merely tedious. "Tell me about the blackmail." She told it plainly enough, which I respected. Garrett Crane ran an orchid nursery in Westchester. Hesper Gardens, specialty hybrids, the kind of operation that sells a single plant for 4 figures to men who otherwise seem entirely sane. And 8 days before his death, he'd come home rattled, poured himself a scotch before dinner instead of after, and told her someone was threatening to expose what he called the arrangement. When she'd pressed him, he'd said only that it concerned the Black Orchid Society, a private club of collectors and breeders, 6 members, of which he was one, and that if certain things came out, every one of us is finished. He hadn't named the things. 4 days later, he was dead at the foot of his own stairs, and the only thing missing from the house, so far as she could determine, was a small notebook he'd kept locked in his desk drawer. 6 members, Wolfe said. "Who are they?" "Besides Garrett, Thomas Reyes, who owns the largest commercial orchid operation on the East Coast. Vivian Holt, who inherited a fortune and spends it cultivating things that don't ask to be loved back. Dr. Adrian Pell, a botanist at the garden, the real one, the Bronx one. Margaret Soto, who I believe has financial troubles, though Garrett never said so directly, and Walter Fenn, who I've met exactly twice and disliked both times, though I couldn't tell you precisely why. And the Society's purpose? Officially, the cultivation and exhibition of rare black-hued hybrids. Unofficially, she paused, and I watched her decide how much of her husband's reputation she was willing to spend on this. Unofficially, I think there was money involved that didn't come from selling flowers. Garrett wasn't a wealthy man before he joined that group. He was after. Wolfe leaned back, which for him is the equivalent of another man leaping to his feet in excitement, and closed his eyes for a moment. Not in boredom, though I'd have been forgiven for guessing that, but in the particular concentration he brings to a problem that has just acquired a shape worth examining. "Mrs. Crane," he said at length, "I find orchids considerably more reliable than people, and considerably less likely to lie to me about why they've wilted. I am disinclined to leave this house, disinclined to interview the police, and entirely disinclined to chase across Westchester after men who breed flowers, and apparently also breed secrets. However," he opened his eyes, "I am not disinclined to be paid for thought, which is the only labor I perform without complaint. My fee is considerable." "I can pay it," she said, and there was steel under the grief now, the kind I'd come to recognize as the thing that gets the job done after the crying's finished. "I want whoever did this exposed. I don't care what it costs, and I don't care whose flowers get trampled doing it." Wolfe almost smiled. With him, almost is the whole event. "Archie," he said, "get the particulars. Mrs. Crane, you will furnish a list of everything your husband told you, however trivial it seemed, and everything you've observed of these 5 people since his death. Who called, who didn't, who sent flowers, and who sent nothing at all. Grief," he added, settling deeper into the chair like a man preparing to be unmoved by anything that might come next, "is a poor liar. It tends to forget its lines." I got out my notebook, mostly to have something to do with my hands, because I already had a feeling about where this was headed. 6 people who bred black orchids, and apparently a few other things besides. One of them dead at the bottom of his own stairs, and a notebook gone missing that probably had names in it that mattered more than Latin binomials. "One more thing," Wolfe said, just as Mrs. Crane was gathering herself to leave. "You said your husband told you every member would be finished if the truth came out. Finished how? Financially? Socially? Or did he mean something more permanent?" Eleanor Crane looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that I filed away without quite naming it yet. Not fear exactly, and not surprise, but the particular stillness of someone realizing a question has teeth. "I don't know," she said, "but I think Garrett was afraid it might mean exactly what it meant for him." Wolfe nodded slowly, and reached for the buzzer that would summon beer, which in his lexicon is the equivalent of rolling up his sleeves. "Then we had better find out," he said, "before someone decides a second demonstration is necessary. Wolfe doesn't like sending me into the field without a reason he can articulate. So before I went anywhere I got the reason. The Black Orchid Society held its monthly meeting at Vivian Holt's place on East 68th Street, and Mrs. Crane had made a point of mentioning that address. Crane had said as much, without my even asking, since apparently grief hadn't dulled her sense of irony. Her husband's killer, whoever it turned out to be, would likely be sipping sherry under somebody's chandelier within 48 hours of putting him in the ground. I called ahead, used my own name and a manufactured pretext about representing an estate interested in acquiring Garrett Crane's collection, and got myself invited as a guest. People with money and orchids are, in my experience, suckers for anyone who might want to buy either. Vivian Holt's townhouse had the kind of quiet that costs real money. Thick carpets, low lighting, air that smelled faintly of greenhouse humidity even in the front hall, which told me she'd had a conservatory built somewhere on the premises, and wasn't shy about running it year-round. She met me at the door herself, which surprised me until I clucked the household staff problem most rich widows develop somewhere around their second decade of being rich and widowed. They trust nobody, and they've usually got good reasons. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, extending a hand that wore 3 rings I could have financed a small car with. Eleanor mentioned you might call. Dreadful business, Garrett. Just dreadful. She didn't look dreadful about it. She looked like a woman discussing a stock that had underperformed. I understand you knew him well. As well as anyone in this group knows anyone else. Which is to say, not very well at all. We're collectors, Mr. Goodwin, not confidants. You don't survive in this hobby by trusting the people who'd happily poison your greenhouse to get a cutting you won't share. That was either candor or theater, and I hadn't been in the room long enough to know which, so I filed it, and let her lead me through to the conservatory, where the other 4 were assembled like a jury that hadn't decided yet whether it liked the defendant. Thomas Reyes was easy to place. Big man, big laugh, the kind of handshake that's trying to win an argument before you've stated your position. He ran the commercial side of the business, the actual money, and he made sure I knew it inside of 90 seconds, dropping the size of his Long Island greenhouses into the conversation the way other men drop their golf handicap. Garrett was a hobbyist who got lucky, he told me, with the easy contempt of a man who's never once doubted his own importance. Good eye for color mutations, no head for business. I kept telling him the society was bleeding him dry, and he wouldn't listen. Bleeding him how? Reyes's laugh came a half-beat late that time. Dues. Acquisition costs. You know how collectors are. Money in, nothing out but flowers that die in a season if you sneeze on them wrong. It was a smooth answer. It was also not an answer to the question I'd actually asked, which is the kind of thing Wolfe trains you to notice if you work for him long enough. Margaret Soto was harder to read, mostly because she seemed to be working at not being read at all. A thin woman in a suit that had been expensive 3 years ago, and was now simply old, sitting very upright, with a glass of sherry she hadn't touched. When I asked about Crane, she said the right things. Sorrow, shock, what a loss to the society. But her hands stayed folded in her lap the whole time, like she was holding something down in there, along with the words. Were you close to him? I asked. Close enough to owe him money, she said, and then looked like she wished the sherry had been real enough to swallow the sentence back down with. I mean, we'd discussed an investment in my business. It's not relevant. What's your business, Mrs. Soto? Imports, she said, and turned to look at the orchids on the far wall with the particular intensity of someone who has just decided the conversation is over. Dr. Adrian Pell was the one I'd been most curious about, given his Bronx garden credentials, and he turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, and somehow also not. A tall, stooped man, with the soft, distracted voice of someone who'd spent 30 years talking to plants, and had only recently been required to talk to people again. He shook my hand like he wasn't entirely sure what a handshake was for. Garrett's death is a scientific loss, as much as a personal one, he said, which struck me as a strange way to grieve a friend, until I realized it might be the only language he had for grief at all. His work on color-stable black hybrids was well. He'd solved the problem that's eluded breeders for 40 years. The notebook alone. He stopped. The notebook? I said, easy as I could manage. His breeding records, cross pairings, germination notes, years of data. If it's lost, Pell's hands had started moving in small, agitated circles, the way some men's do when they're more upset about an idea than an event. If it's lost, that work dies with him, truly dies. Do you understand what that means? I said I understood, though what I mostly understood was that Pell knew the notebook was missing, which meant either Eleanor Crane had told him, or he'd been close enough to the situation to know it on his own. Crane, when I checked later, swore she'd told no one outside the family. That left Walter Fenn, who turned out to be a slight, watchful man in his 50s, who said almost nothing the entire visit, stood slightly apart from the others, the way a man stands apart from a group he's calculating rather than enjoying, and left within 10 minutes of my arrival without so much as a goodbye to his hostess. The only thing he said to me directly, on his way out the door, was delivered quietly enough that I doubt the others heard it. "You're not buying orchids, Mr. Goodwin," he said. "I don't know what you're buying, but it isn't that." Then he was gone, and I was left standing in a conservatory full of expensive flowers, and 5 people who'd each said one true thing and several careful things, trying to work out which was which. I drove back to the brownstone, turning it over. Reyes had dodged a direct question about money with practiced ease. Soto had nearly confessed a debt and then snatched it back. Pell knew about a notebook he shouldn't have known about, or claimed to know about it in a way that revealed more interest than grief. Fen had clocked me for a fraud inside 10 minutes and walked out rather than play along. And Vivian Holt had opened her own front door to a stranger in a city where rich widows don't open doors, which told me either she had nothing to hide or she wanted very badly to look like she didn't. Wolfe was at his desk with a bottle of beer and the orchid catalogs when I got back, and I gave him the whole afternoon, verbatim as I could manage, the way he likes it. Not my conclusions, just the facts, because he's made it clear more than once that my conclusions are worth exactly what he pays me to keep them to myself, until asked. He listened with his eyes closed, which means he's listening hardest. And when I finished, he sat without speaking for long enough that I started counting the orchid blooms on the nearest spray, out of boredom. "Fen," he said finally, "is the only one of the 5 who told you anything resembling the truth, and he did it by telling you that everyone else was lying. That is either remarkably honest or remarkably clever, Archie, and I confess I don't yet know which is itself interesting, because I generally know within the first sentence." "And the notebook?" "The notebook," Wolfe said, "is the only object in this entire affair that anyone has bothered to steal, which means it is either evidence of the blackmail Mrs. Crane mentioned, or it is the blackmail itself. Dr. Pell wants it back for his flowers. I suspect someone else wants it back for considerably less botanical reasons." He reached for the buzzer. "Get Mr. Reyes on the telephone. I find I'd like him in this office tomorrow morning, and I find I'd like to hear him answer the question you so politely allowed him to avoid. Inspector Henry Dolan and I have what you might call an understanding, built over several years and at least as many bodies. He doesn't like Wolfe, he likes me marginally better, and he tolerates both of us because Wolfe has a habit of handing the department solved cases with a bow on top, which makes Dolan look good to people above him who don't care how the sausage got made. I caught him at the precinct a little after 9 the next morning, before his coffee had finished working, which is the best time to catch Dolan if you want him talkative instead of merely tolerant. "Crane," he said when I told him what I wanted, "accidental fall, case closed, and before you say it, no, Goodwin, I don't appreciate Nero Wolfe deciding 4 days after my detective signed off that he's got opinions about it. He hasn't got opinions yet. He's got a client and a retainer and a healthy curiosity. Can I see the file or not? Dolan likes to make me work for things, even when he's going to give them to me anyway. So I sat through 5 minutes of grumbling about budget cuts and overtime before he slid the folder across, and I read it standing up because he's never once offered me a chair. The medical examiner's report was thinner than I'd expected, given how thick the file otherwise was, and the conclusion read the way these things read when nobody's looked too hard. Blunt trauma to the back of the skull and a fractured cervical vertebra, consistent with a fall down a flight of 12 carpeted stairs. Time of death, between 9 and 10:30 in the evening, based on the housekeeper's discovery of the body at 6 the following morning, and the usual unpleasant calculations doctors make about a body left overnight. But there was a line in the notes, easy to skip past if you weren't reading for it, about bruising on both of Crane's forearms. Not the kind of bruising you get from a railing on the way down, the examiner noted almost as an aside, but the kind you get from someone gripping you hard enough to leave 4 fingers and a thumb on each arm. "Dolan," I said, "this bruising, anybody follow up on it? Man falls downstairs, he flails, grabs at things. That's not a mystery, Goodwin, that's gravity. You ever flail and leave a perfect handprint on your own forearm, both arms, matching? That got me a look that told me he'd noticed it too and decided not to chase it, which is the kind of thing that happens in busy precincts with too many bodies and not enough hours. And I don't say that as an insult to Dolan, so much as an observation about the world he works in. I asked if I could copy the relevant pages, and he said no, then let me anyway, while pretending to take a phone call, which is how these things generally go between us. The other thing in the file that caught my eye was a note from the housekeeper's statement. She'd mentioned that Mr. Crane had had a visitor that evening, someone who'd called the house around 8:30 asking to come by, and that she'd let the visitor in around 9, before leaving for the night, as was her custom on Thursdays. She hadn't gotten a name. She'd assumed it was society business, since most everyone who called at that hour these days seemed to be. That detail hadn't made it into anyone's conclusions, as far as I could tell, which told me either nobody had thought to chase it, or somebody had decided not to. I spent the rest of the morning running down alibis, which is unglamorous work, consisting mostly of telephone calls and people lying to me with varying degrees of skill. Thomas Reyes told me, when I reached him, that he'd been at a business dinner at the Cattlemen's Club until 11 that night, dining with 2 associates whose names he gave readily enough. A little too readily, the way a man recites something he's rehearsed, rather than something he simply remembers. I called the club. The maitre d' confirmed the reservation, confirmed 3 men had dined there, and confirmed when I pressed gently that one of the 3 gentlemen had in fact left around 9:15, before the entrees were cleared. He couldn't say for certain which of the 3 it had been, not from memory, but he thought it might have been the big one, with the laugh. Margaret Soto's alibi was thinner still. She said she'd been home alone, which is the alibi of someone with nobody to vouch for them, and no particular reason to expect she'd need one. But when I checked, almost as an afterthought, with a contact who does discreet work for a couple of the import-export outfits downtown, I learned that Soto's company had cleared a debt of just over $11,000, exactly 3 days after Garrett Crane's death, paid in full, in cash, to a creditor who'd apparently been threatening legal action for months. Where a woman with financial troubles finds $11,000 in cash 3 days after her business partner dies is not strictly speaking evidence of anything, but it's the kind of coincidence Wolfe likes to chew on. Dr. Pell said he'd been at the garden until nearly midnight, working in the herbarium, and that the night guard could confirm it. The guard confirmed Pell had signed in and signed out at 9:40, not midnight, a fact Pell either hadn't expected anyone to check or had simply misremembered, though misremembering 2.5 hours struck me as ambitious even for an absent-minded botanist. Walter Fenn, when I finally tracked him down at a small apartment on the Upper West Side that didn't match the quiet wealth he'd projected at Vivian Holt's, told me flatly that he'd been home all evening and had no one to confirm it, and added, without my asking, that he assumed I'd already worked out he was the only one of the 5 who wasn't lying to me about something, which was either a remarkably confident thing to say or a remarkably stupid one. Vivian Holt I saved for last, mostly because I suspected she'd be the hardest to rattle, and I wasn't wrong. She told me she'd hosted no one that evening, had been home with her household staff, all of whom could confirm it, and when I mentioned, gently the way you mention something you're not sure matters yet, that Crane had had a visitor around 9 that nobody could identify, she went very still for just a fraction of a second, before recovering her composure. "How extraordinary," she said. "I wonder who that could have been." I drove back to the brownstone with 4 alibis that didn't hold the weight they were built to hold. One mystery visitor nobody had bothered to identify, and bruises on a dead man's arms that looked considerably less like an accident than the report had been willing to admit. Wolfe was in the office, working through a crossword of his own, when I gave him the rundown, and for once he didn't close his eyes. He set the pencil down and looked at me the way he looks at a particularly promising orchid spike, with the patience of a man who knows something is about to bloom. "4 lies," he said, "and 1 truth that may itself be a lie, cleverly disguised as candor. Archie, I begin to suspect Mr. Crane did not fall down his own stairs at all. I suspect someone helped him and held his arms while doing it, and that someone called ahead at 8:30 to make certain the housekeeper would be gone by 9 and wouldn't see their face. Which means it was somebody he knew well enough to let in without question. Or somebody clever enough to make him believe he had no choice. Wolfe reached for the beer Fritz had left on the desk, though it had gone warm in the time he'd spent thinking. Get Mr. Reyes on the telephone again. I find his headache at the Cattlemen's Club considerably more interesting than his dinner. Thomas Reyes arrived at 6 minutes past 3, in a coat that cost more than my first car, and from the moment Fritz showed him into the office, I could tell he hadn't slept well. There's a particular tightness around the eyes that money can't buy off, and Reyes had it bad. Wolfe let him sit for a full 30 seconds without speaking, which is a trick he uses on big men especially, since silence does to the talkative what an empty room does to an actor. It makes them want to fill it. Mr. Reyes, Wolfe said finally, you told my associate you dined at the Cattlemen's Club on the night Garrett Crane died, departing at 11. The maitre d' recalls one of your party of 3 leaving considerably earlier at approximately 9:15, citing a headache. Reyes's laugh came out thinner than it had in Vivian Holt's conservatory. Maitre d's get confused. Busy night. He was quite specific. He recalled the laugh. Wolfe let that sit. I am not a man who enjoys repeating himself, Mr. Reyes, so I will say this once. I do not believe you have committed murder. I believe with somewhat more confidence that you have lied to Mr. Goodwin about your evening, and that you are continuing to lie to me now, and that this is generally a poor strategy when speaking with someone whose entire livelihood depends on detecting precisely that. You don't believe I did it? Something in Reyes's posture shifted. Not relief exactly, more like a man recalculating which version of the truth he could afford to tell. I find the timing inconvenient for your guilt, not impossible. A man who leaves dinner at 9:15 could reach Crane's house by 1:30, hold his arms while he fell, and return home with a fabricated headache. But murderers who plan ahead rarely choose an alibi that collapses on a single phone call to a maitre d'. You are either innocent and careless, or guilty and remarkably stupid, and I confess a professional reluctance to believe the latter of any man successful enough to own greenhouses the size of yours. That, delivered in Wolfe's flattest register, was about as close to a compliment as Reyes was likely to get out of him. And it worked exactly as intended. The big man's shoulders came down an inch. I wasn't at Crane's, he said. I left dinner because I had somewhere else to be. Somewhere I'd rather my wife didn't hear about, if it's all the same to you gentlemen. It is rarely all the same to me, Wolfe said, but go on. Reyes went on, reluctantly, the way men do when they've decided the smaller embarrassment is cheaper than the larger suspicion. A woman, not Vivian Holt, not anyone connected to the society at all, an arrangement he'd been keeping quiet for the better part of a year. An apartment on the east side, he'd driven to directly from the Cattlemen's Club. What route? Wolfe asked, with the sudden precision of a man who's heard the confession and already moved past it to the part that actually matters. What route? To this apartment, from the club. Reyes blinked, then named the streets, and I watched Wolfe's eyes narrow slightly, because the route he'd named ran within 2 blocks of Garrett Crane's address. Did you pass Mr. Crane's street? Yeah, down Lexington, then I cut across. I'd have passed the end of his block, maybe. And here was the thing about Reyes. For all his bluster, he wasn't a stupid man. And once he understood what Wolfe was actually asking, his face changed in a way that told me he'd been sitting on this without realizing its weight. There was a car, he said slowly, parked at the corner, half on the curb, the way somebody parks when they're not planning to stay long. I noticed it because it was an odd spot to park. Nothing else around there but Crane's place and the empty lot next door. Green sedan, older model. I remember because it looked exactly like the one Pell drives. He brought it to one of Vivian's dinners last spring. Made some fuss about the upholstery being original. What time? 9:45, maybe 10 of. Wolfe sat with that for a moment, and I sat with it too, doing the arithmetic that didn't need doing aloud. Pell had signed out of the garden at 9:40, by the night guard's own log. 9:45 put him within a 5-minute drive of exactly where Reyes claimed to have seen his car. You're certain of the make? Reasonably. I know cars. And you didn't mention this to the police. Reyes had the decency to look uncomfortable. I didn't want anybody asking what I was doing on that block at that hour. Figured it wasn't my business anyway. Accidental fall, that's what the papers said. Wasn't till your man started calling around this morning that I thought maybe it mattered. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, turning something over behind those half-closed eyes. And when he spoke again, it was slower, more deliberate, the tone he uses when a piece has clicked into a place he hadn't quite expected. Mr. Reyes, I would ask that you keep your evening's other business to yourself for the present, as I see no reason to complicate your domestic affairs over a detail that may prove entirely irrelevant to your character and entirely relevant to someone else's. But I will need you to repeat what you've told me, under oath if necessary, should this matter proceed that far. You think it was Pell? I think, Wolfe said, that Dr. Pell told my associate he remained at the garden until midnight, when in fact he departed at 9:45, and that a car resembling his was seen within a few minutes' drive of Mr. Crane's house at almost precisely that hour. I think a man devoted enough to a colleague's breeding notes to call their loss a scientific tragedy might also be devoted enough to retrieve those notes by less than scientific means. And I think it is exceedingly premature to call this a conclusion, Mr. Reyes, since premature conclusions are how innocent men hang and guilty men go free, and I find both outcomes equally distasteful. He dismissed Reyes shortly after, with the particular courtesy he extends to people who finally told him something useful, and once the door had closed, Wolfe sat with his fingers laced over his stomach, staring at the middle distance in a way I'd learned not to interrupt. Archie, he said eventually, Dr. Pell told you the notebook's loss meant his life's interest in Crane's breeding work might die with it. A man speaks that way about something he wants returned, not something he's already taken. Unless he hasn't found it yet. Unless he hasn't found it yet, Wolfe agreed, and went to that house on the night of the murder not to kill a man, but to search one, and found himself through panic or miscalculation doing both. Get me Dr. Pell's number. I find I would very much like to ask him a question about the upholstery in his car, and watch his face while he decides whether lying about it is worth the trouble. The Bronx garden in March is mostly bare branches and hopeful signage, but the herbarium where Dr. Pell worked was warm as a held breath, all glass and humidity pipes, and I found him exactly where the guards said I would, hunched over a specimen tray with the kind of concentration that made me feel like an intrusion before I'd said a word. Mr. Goodwin. He didn't look up. I assume you're here about the car. That saved me some preamble. I am. You told me midnight. The guard's log says 9:40. Pell set down whatever delicate thing he'd been holding and finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't guilt exactly. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who's been carrying something heavier than he let on. My sister is dying, he said. St. Vincent's. I go most evenings after the garden closes, and I haven't told anyone because I find sympathy intolerable when I'm trying to hold myself together long enough to function. I left at 9:40, drove to the hospital, sat with her until past 1 in the morning. The night nurse on her floor will confirm it. Nurse Adler, Ward 6. I lied about the time, because admitting where I actually was felt like inviting questions I didn't want to answer, and because frankly, Mr. Goodwin, it never occurred to me that my whereabouts the night Garrett died would matter to anyone at all. I called the hospital from a payphone in the lobby before I'd even left the building, mostly because I've learned the hard way that sympathetic stories deserve verification precisely because they're sympathetic. And Nurse Adler confirmed it, inside 30 seconds. Dr. Pell had been there from shortly after 10 until well past 1, sitting with a patient in room 614, quiet as a man keeping vigil generally is. Which put Pell in the clear, and put Wolfe's tidy theory about the green sedan back on the table. Except now, it didn't have an owner standing in front of it. "The car," I said, when I went back to find him. "It's not yours anymore, is it?" Pell's expression shifted into something almost relieved, the way people get when somebody else finally asks the question they've been waiting to be asked. "I sold it in January. Needed the money for—" He gestured vaguely, in the direction of hospitals and the costs that come with them. "Walter Fenn bought it. Paid cash, didn't haggle, didn't seem to care that the radio doesn't work. I thought it was strange at the time, a man like that, not caring about a radio. He struck me as someone who'd care about every detail." That was the first genuinely useful thing anybody had told me all week. And I drove straight from the Bronx to Margaret Soto's apartment instead of going home, because something about Pell's last sentence had snagged in my mind. A man who cares about every detail, except the ones that don't matter to whatever he's actually buying the car for. Soto wasn't pleased to see me, but she let me in. Mostly, I think, because she'd had 3 days to sit alone with whatever she'd almost told me in Vivian Holt's conservatory, and it had clearly been eating at her. "I lied about the 11,000, she said, before I'd even gotten my coat off, in the tone of someone who's rehearsed a confession and wants it over with quickly. It wasn't from a sale. Walter brought it to me himself, 2 days after Garrett died. Cash, in an envelope, no explanation beyond, 'This should help with your difficulties.' I took it because I needed it, and because I was afraid of what it would mean if I asked too many questions about where it came from." "Afraid how?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. "There were others before Garrett," she said finally. "Investors. Patrons, Walter calls them, though I've never met one, never seen a name on paper. Money that came into the society for acquisitions, sales that were worth far more on contracts than any sane buyer would actually pay for a flower, no matter how rare. I didn't ask where it originated. None of us did, except Garrett, eventually, and look what it got him." "You think Fenn killed him?" "I think Walter Fenn collects debts for people who don't like being told no, Mr. Goodwin. And I think Garrett had decided to tell someone no. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do in this particular garden." I left Soto's apartment with considerably more than I'd arrived with, and drove to Eleanor Crane's, where one more piece dropped into place. She'd remembered, since we'd last spoken, that Garrett had visited a lawyer's office on 42nd Street 9 days before he died. Not their family attorney, a different firm entirely, one she didn't recognize, and had come home afterward looking, in her words, like a man who'd finally decided something he couldn't take back. She hadn't thought it mattered until I asked, point blank, whether Garrett might have been planning to go to the authorities. "He said something," she admitted, "about doing right by people, even if it cost him everything. I thought he meant me. I think now he might have meant something else entirely." I called the firm from her front hall, gave them my name and Wolfe's, and got nowhere directly. Lawyers don't hand out client confidences to a stranger on the phone, no matter how politely you ask. But the receptionist, who I suspect didn't realize what she was confirming, mentioned that Mr. Crane's appointment had concerned drafting a statement, and that he'd asked, before leaving, how quickly such a statement could be delivered to a federal office if needed. I drove home with the pieces rearranging themselves the whole way. Garrett Crane hadn't simply been a victim of blackmail. He'd been a participant who'd gotten close enough to the money to understand exactly what it was and where it came from. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks of his life, he'd decided he was done being part of it. Done enough to draft a confession. Done enough to threaten the whole arrangement from the inside, which made him infinitely more dangerous to whoever stood to lose the most than any outside threat could have been. Wolfe listened to the whole account that evening without interrupting once, which from him is practically a standing ovation. and when I finished, he sat for a long moment with his hands folded, looking not at me, but at the orchid spray on his desk, as though it might have an opinion worth consulting. "Mr. Fenn," he said at last, "bought a car he had no apparent interest in, paid a debt that wasn't his to pay, and told you on his way out of Vivian Holt's house that you weren't buying orchids, an observation that required him to be paying close enough attention to a stranger to notice what you weren't doing, rather than simply accepting what you claimed to be doing, which is not the habit of a casual hobbyist. I begin to suspect, Archie, that Mr. Fenn has spent considerably more of his life watching people than breeding flowers, and that the Black Orchid Society has functioned, for some time now, as a laundry rather than a garden." And Crane found the books. Crane, Wolfe said, kept the books, in that notebook everyone is so anxious to recover. Disguised, I should think, as breeding records. Cross pairings that are not pairings of flowers at all, but of figures. He kept them out of necessity, perhaps, or vanity, or simple bookkeeping habit, and then he made the catastrophic decision to use them for a purpose other than the one for which he'd been permitted to keep them at all. He reached for the bell. "I find I would like to know a great deal more about Mr. Fenn before I see him again, and I find I would like Saul Panzer's particular talents applied to the question of who, precisely, has been paying him to collect debts that aren't his." Saul Panzer came by at 9:30 that evening, let himself in the way he always does, like a man who's been walking through that door so long the house has stopped noticing him, and dropped himself into the chair across from Wolfe's desk with the quiet economy of motion that's made him the best operative in New York for longer than I've been keeping count. "Walter Fenn," he said, without preamble, because Saul doesn't believe in preambles any more than Wolfe believes in leaving the house. "Isn't who he says he is. Not entirely. Born Walter Fenimore. Changed it legally 11 years ago, no obvious reason filed with the court beyond personal preference. Before that, he worked 14 years as an accountant for a textile importer in Newark that folded under a fraud investigation in 1971. Fenn was never charged, testified as a cooperating witness, walked away clean, while 2 other men went to prison." "Interesting," Wolfe said, in the tone he uses when something is considerably more than interesting. "His apartment's leased under a corporate name, Brindle Holdings, registered out of Delaware, no officers listed beyond a registered agent. Same name shows up twice more, on a bank account that's received 11 deposits over the past 2 years, ranging from $4,000 to $31,000, all timed within a week or two of recorded sales by the Black Orchid Society. The money comes in from a second account, also Brindle, also Delaware, and from there the trail just stops. No further company behind it. No patron, no investor, nobody pulling strings from a penthouse somewhere, far as I could find. I felt something settle into place even before Wolfe said it. The particular click you get when a piece you'd assumed was load-bearing turns out to be decorative. There is no patron, Wolfe said. Don't look like it. Looks like Fenn's been paying himself through 2 shells he controls, and calling it outside money, so nobody in the society asks why their flowers are suddenly worth 4 times what any sane collector would pay. Wolfe sat with that for a long moment, and I watched the shape of the whole thing rearrange itself behind his eyes. Not the satisfaction of a man who solved something, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man, recognizing that he'd been solving the wrong puzzle for several days, and had only just been handed the right one. He invented an investor, Wolfe said slowly, to explain money that was in fact his own. Money that originated, I should guess, with the textile fraud Mr. Fenn so conveniently survived unscathed. He could not simply deposit it. Men who testify against their partners and walk away with intact savings invite scrutiny. But money that passes through a respectable hobby, laundered as the proceeds of rare flower sales among wealthy collectors, attracts no scrutiny whatsoever, particularly when the collectors themselves believe they're merely benefiting from a generous outside patron's enthusiasm for orchids. And Crane figured it out, I said. Crane, Wolfe said, kept the books. Whether he was recruited for his discretion or his naivety I cannot yet say. But at some point in the past several weeks, he ceased being a useful and pliable bookkeeper, and became instead A man with a conscience, inconveniently attached to a notebook full of evidence. He visited a lawyer. He drafted a statement. He told his wife in the only language he had left for it, that everyone in that society would be finished if the truth came out. Not realizing, perhaps, that for one of them, finished meant something considerably more permanent than disgrace. "Fen," I said. Fen called at 8:30 to arrange a visit, ensuring the housekeeper would be gone before he arrived. Fen held Crane's arms. The bruising is consistent with a man restraining another at close range, not catching himself in a fall. And Fen, I suspect, either pushed him or simply released him at the top of those stairs, after Crane had already lost his footing in the struggle, which amounts to the same crime under a different name. He searched the house for the notebook afterward, and either found it incompletely or didn't find it at all, which would explain why Dr. Pell still speaks of it as lost rather than recovered, and why no one has yet produced it. I thought about Fen's voice on his way out of Vivian Holt's conservatory. Quiet, watchful, almost amused. "You're not buying orchids, Mr. Goodwin." A man that observant doesn't make careless mistakes, which meant if the notebook hadn't turned up yet, it was either somewhere Fen hadn't thought to look, or somewhere he'd looked and decided wasn't worth the risk of retrieving. "There's a problem," I said. "If Fen invented the whole patron story and he's the only one who actually understood the scheme, why would killing Crane stop anything? The other 4 don't know enough to expose the laundering specifically. They think they've just been getting lucky with a generous investor." "Because Crane's notebook," Wolfe said, "did not merely record sales. It recorded, I would wager, the structure beneath them. Dates, amounts, the pattern of deposits Saul has just described to us. A federal investigator handed that notebook would need very little imagination to trace Brindle Holdings back to Walter Fen within a week. Crane did not need to understand the scheme's architecture to destroy its architect. He needed only to hand over the numbers and let men paid to notice such things do the rest." He set his palms flat on the desk, which is as close as Wolfe gets to rising with purpose. "We have a theory, Archie, complete and I believe correct in its essentials. What we lack is the notebook, or any proof beyond circumstance that will survive a competent defense attorney's scrutiny. Mr. Fen is by every account a careful man. Careful men do not confess to inference. So what do we do with a theory we can't prove?" Wolfe's eyes had taken on the particular gleam I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to something I generally didn't enjoy executing, nearly as much as he enjoyed devising. "Fen believes the notebook has been found," he said, "and we watch, with great care, what a careful man does when he believes his carefulness has finally failed him." Wolfe doesn't often ask 5 people into his office at once, on the theory that a room full of suspects is a room full of alibis reinforcing each other. But he made an exception on Thursday evening, summoning Reyes, Soto, Pell, Fen, and Vivian Holt under the pretext, delivered by me, over the telephone, in a tone calculated to sound like routine follow-up, rather than anything resembling a trap, that Mr. Wolfe had concluded his preliminary inquiries and wished to share his findings before involving the police further. They came. People with something to hide almost always come, because not coming looks worse than sitting through whatever's about to happen. And by 8 o'clock, I had all 5 of them, arranged in a half-circle of chairs facing Wolfe's desk, with Vivian Holt in the red leather chair by default, since she'd arrived first and nobody had the nerve to ask her to move. Wolfe let the silence work for a while before he spoke, the way he always does, and when he finally addressed them, his voice had the particular flatness he uses when he wants every word taken as fact rather than performance. "Garrett Crane," he said, "did not fall down his own stairs. He was held and released by someone he trusted enough to let into his home after his housekeeper had gone for the evening. I do not yet have the entirety of this matter resolved to my satisfaction, but I have learned a great deal in the past several days, and I expect to learn the remainder shortly, because Mr. Crane's notebook, the one so many of you have mentioned to my associate, in one context or another, has been recovered. I watched 5 faces do 5 different things. Reyes's eyebrows went up, the unguarded reaction of a man who hadn't expected good news and didn't quite trust it. Soto's hands, folded as always in her lap, tightened until the knuckles showed. Pell leaned forward with something that looked almost like hope, the scientist's hope, for data restored rather than justice served. Vivian Holt's expression didn't move at all, which from a woman who'd been composed throughout every conversation I'd had with her, told me less than I wanted it to. Fenn's face did the least of anyone's, and that, more than anything, was the thing Wolfe had been watching for. "Where?" Fenn said, in a voice so level it might have been discussing the weather. "Was it found?" "In a hidden compartment beneath the potting bench in Mr. Crane's greenhouse," Wolfe said. His housekeeper recalled, upon further questioning, that he kept what she described as his private accounts there, beneath a false bottom he'd built himself some years ago, for reasons she'd never thought to ask about. The police retrieved it this afternoon. I expect a full forensic accounting of its contents within the week. That last detail was invented from whole cloth. Wolfe had constructed it for precisely this room, precisely this audience, on the theory that a lie specific enough to sound like fact would either pass unnoticed by the innocent or detonate something in the one person who knew, better than anyone in that office, exactly where the real notebook wasn't. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Reyes asked what was in it, and Wolfe told him, with perfect composure, that he wasn't yet at liberty to say. And the meeting wound down into the kind of stiff, watchful small talk that happens when 5 people who don't trust each other are waiting for permission to leave a room. Fenn left first. I noted the time, 8:41, and noted too that he didn't say goodbye to anyone, which from the man who told me directly that I wasn't buying orchids struck me as exactly the kind of detail he'd normally have bothered to perform. Saul was already in position outside Crane's Westchester property by the time Fenn's car would have made the drive, having gone up there at Wolfe's instruction 2 hours earlier, with nothing more than a thermos and the patience that's made him worth every dollar Wolfe pays him. I drove up myself a little after 9, parked half a mile down the road, the way Saul had told me to, and walked the rest of the way through cold enough to make me regret every decision that had led me into this line of work. A little before 10, headlights swung into the drive, cut off well short of the house, and a man's shape moved across the lawn toward the greenhouse, with the careful, unhurried economy of someone who's done this kind of thing before, and isn't planning to be careless about it now. Fenn had a flashlight, shielded mostly by his hand, and he went straight for the potting bench. Straight for it. No hesitation, no searching, which told me plainly enough that he'd known exactly where it was before tonight, because a man hunting blind doesn't move with that kind of certainty in the dark. We let him get the false bottom open, before Saul switched on the work lights Crane's housekeeper had left wired up for exactly this kind of late watering, and the sudden flood of brightness caught Fenn crouched on the floor with his hands still inside the compartment, blinking like a man who'd forgotten the world contained anything but the thing he was looking for. "Evening, Mr. Fenn," Saul said, in the mild, unhurried tone he uses on men twice his size who haven't yet realized how much trouble they're in. "Find what you were after?" Fenn's composure didn't crack so much as recalibrate, the way a skilled liar's does when the lie they've been telling stops being useful and a new one has to be assembled on the spot. "I had reason to believe something of mine had been misplaced here," he said. "Personal correspondence. I didn't think it would be missed." "At 10 o'clock at night," I said, with a flashlight, in another man's greenhouse, 4 days after he died falling down his own stairs. "I don't have to explain myself to either of you." "No," I agreed, "but you'll likely have to explain it to Inspector Dolan, who I expect will be considerably less patient about the hour." That landed harder than anything Wolfe had said in the office, because it was the first concrete thing in the entire affair. Not theory, not pattern, not careful arithmetic about shell companies and deposit dates, but a man caught with his hand in a dead man's hiding place at 10 o'clock at night, unable to produce a single believable reason for being there. He didn't say much else. Saul called it in. I called Wolfe. And by midnight, Walter Fenn was sitting in a precinct interview room with a lawyer he'd apparently had on retainer for exactly this kind of contingency. Saying nothing at all, which is itself a kind of confession to anyone who's spent enough time around guilty men to recognize the particular silence of someone choosing their words because every other option has already run out. I called Wolfe from a payphone outside the precinct, gave him the whole account, and he listened without interrupting until I'd finished. He went straight to the compartment, Wolfe said. Not the house, not the desk where his housekeeper said he kept his accounts. The compartment beneath the bench, the very detail I invented for that room tonight. Which means he already knew it was there before you ever said it. Which means, Wolfe said, with the particular satisfaction of a man watching the last piece of a difficult puzzle settle precisely into place, that Mr. Fenn searched that greenhouse once before, the night Garrett Crane died, found the compartment, and either failed to open it in his haste or found it empty of what he was looking for, and assumed Crane had moved the notebook elsewhere in the days before his death. Tonight he merely returned to confirm what he'd missed the first time. Archie, we no longer have a theory. We have a man caught in the act of proving it for us. Inspector Dolan does not enjoy being invited anywhere by Nero Wolfe, and he likes it even less when he discovers on arrival that 4 people he hasn't yet formally interviewed are already seated in the office waiting for him. But by Saturday afternoon, he'd had 2 days to sit with the fact that he'd caught a man breaking into a dead man's greenhouse with no good explanation. And curiosity, in my experience, eventually beats pride in even the most stubborn policeman. Eleanor Crane sat in a chair near the door, where she'd insisted on sitting, saying she wanted to see this through, but didn't trust herself to sit any closer to the people who'd let her husband die. Reyes, Soto, Pell, and Vivian Holt occupied the remaining chairs in something like the same configuration as before, though considerably less composed than the first time, since all 4 of them had spent the past 2 days reading newspapers that used the word arrested in connection with a man they'd shared sherry with for years. Wolfe waited until Fritz had served coffee, because Wolfe believes good manners survive even murder, and then folded his hands and began. Garrett Crane, he said, was killed by Walter Fenn on the evening of the 11th in his own front hall, for reasons that have nothing to do with orchids and everything to do with arithmetic. He let that settle before continuing, and I watched the 4 faces in front of him do the math themselves. Not the murder, which they'd already half suspected, but the arithmetic, which none of them had been told yet. The Black Orchid Society, Wolfe went on, has for the past 2 years served as a laundry for money belonging to Mr. Fenn alone. There was no patron, there was no generous outside investor whose enthusiasm inflated the value of your rarer hybrids. There was Walter Fenn, formerly Walter Fenimore, an accountant who testified against his partners in a textile fraud in 1971, and walked away with savings no honest accountant accumulates on salary alone. He could not simply deposit that money. He needed a respectable channel through which it could emerge looking earned, and a private club of wealthy collectors, each eager to believe the others were paying genuine prices for genuinely rare flowers, served the purpose admirably. He told us the money came from a patron, Vivian Holt said, and for the first time since I'd met her, something other than composure moved across her face. Not guilt, I thought, but the particular fury of a woman realizing she'd been used as scenery in someone else's production. I introduced 2 of you to him on that understanding. You were not alone in believing it, Wolfe said, not unkindly. Mr. Crane believed it too, for some time. He kept records, meticulous ones, as careful men often do. And at some point in recent months, his diligence outran his discretion. He began, I believe, to notice the pattern, the deposits, the timing, the absence of any actual patron behind the curtain. He was, by every account I've gathered, a man more comfortable with flowers than with people. But flowers don't lie to you about where money comes from. And once Mr. Crane started asking that question seriously, he found himself unable to stop. Pell spoke for the first time, quietly. He visited a lawyer. He did. 9 days before his death, he engaged a firm unconnected to his family's usual counsel and drafted a sworn statement detailing what he'd discovered, the deposits, the dates, the absence of any verifiable patron, and his own growing certainty that the society's apparent prosperity rested on something considerably less legitimate than rare hybrids. He told his wife only that everyone in the society would be finished if the truth emerged, not realizing, I think, how literally that word would apply to himself. "You said he was killed for arithmetic," Ray said. "What arithmetic?" "The arithmetic of exposure," Wolfe said. Mr. Crane's statement, once filed, would have led federal investigators directly to Brindle Holdings, the shell through which Mr. Fenn's money passed, and from Brindle Holdings directly to Mr. Fenn. Fenn himself, a man who had already once testified his way out of prison and would find no such leniency offered twice. Mr. Fenn called Mr. Crane's home at 8:30 on the evening of the 11th, having presumably learned, through some indiscretion or observation within the society, that Crane intended to act. He arranged to call when the housekeeper would be gone. He held Mr. Crane's arms. The bruising on both forearms is consistent with restraint, not a fall. And somewhere in that struggle, at the top of a staircase, Mr. Crane went down and did not get up again. The room had gone very quiet. Eleanor Crane was looking at her hands. He searched the house that night for Crane's notebook, Wolfe continued, found a hidden compartment beneath the potting bench in the greenhouse, and discovered, to his considerable alarm, that it was empty, because Mr. Crane, anticipating precisely this danger, had already delivered his actual records and sworn statement to his attorney for safekeeping, to be forwarded to federal authorities in the event anything happened to him. Mr. Fenn killed a man to silence evidence that had already left the building 3 days earlier. When I told this room, on Thursday evening, that the notebook had been recovered from that same hiding place, I lied. There was no notebook there, and never had been since the night of the murder. But Mr. Fenn, not knowing that, returned that same night to confirm what he'd missed the first time, and was caught in the act by Mr. Panzer and Mr. Goodwin. Dolan, who had been silent through all of this, with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of it he could use, finally spoke. The attorneys confirmed it, got the statement and a sealed envelope of financial records this morning, soon as we served the order. Matches everything Wolfe's telling you, near enough to the letter. "So it's over," Margaret Soto said, in a voice that suggested she hadn't quite decided whether to be relieved or ashamed. "The murder. Yes. The remainder, the question of what each of you knew and when, and what you did with money you suspected wasn't entirely clean, is a matter for Inspector Dolan, and I should think the federal authorities Mr. Crane intended to involve before his death intervened. I would not advise any of you to assume his silence on your behalf was permanent, since it appears, even now, to be having precisely the effect he hoped it would." Nobody had much to say to that, and the meeting broke up the way these things generally do, quietly, with the particular discomfort of people who've just watched their own complicity get named out loud in a room they can't leave fast enough. Eleanor Crane stayed behind a moment, and thanked Wolfe in a voice that had finally found something like steadiness, and told him that whatever else came of it, at least now she knew her husband hadn't simply fallen down his own stairs through carelessness, that he died in the end trying to do the one decent thing available to him, even if it had cost him everything to do it. Wolfe told her that decency rarely comes cheaply, and that Mr. Crane had at least had the satisfaction, however briefly enjoyed, of choosing his own ending rather than having it chosen for him, which is more than most people manage. Then he rang for beer, because the case was solved, and certain rituals don't wait on anyone's grief. I walked Mrs. Crane to the door myself, and when I came back, Wolfe was already deep in his orchid catalogs again. As if Walter Fenn, and his shell companies, and his patient, careful crouch in another man's greenhouse, had never interrupted anything at all. "You know," I said, "for a man who claims he'd rather talk to flowers than people, you just spent 40 minutes explaining exactly why people are more interesting." "Flowers," Wolfe said without looking up, "do not generally murder each other over money. It is, I confess, the single most disappointing thing about them." I figured that was as close to the last word as I was going to get, and went to see about my own dinner, leaving him to his orchids and his beer, and the particular satisfaction of a man who'd solve, once again, exactly the kind of problem he claimed never to want in the first place.